Right now, as you read these words, nearly half the people on Earth are about to sit down to a meal of the same food. Not bread, not meat, but a handful of small white grains. Rice feeds more than 3.5 billion people. That's 1 in every 2 human beings on the planet. It's grown in almost 100 countries, on every continent except frozen Antarctica. No other plant in history has held so many human destinies in its grasp. And it all began with a slender wild grass by the water. Let's travel back more than 10,000 years, into the very heart of China, to the middle reaches of the great Yangtze River. There, in Hunan province, lie caves with names that twist the tongue, Yushanyan and Diaotongwan. When scientists sifted through the ancient soil on their floors, they found tiny clues, fossilized fragments of plants, and charred grains of wild rice. These finds told a quiet but vital story. People lived here who didn't yet know how to sow. They came to the thickets of wild rice and gathered whatever had grown on its own. But this was painfully hard work. Wild rice is brutally unkind to the gatherer. The moment a grain ripens, it falls straight to the ground. That's how the plant reproduces. It drops its seeds so new ones can sprout. But for a hungry human, it meant half the harvest fell into the mud and water before a hand could reach it. For centuries, people gathered this slippery bread, losing most of it. And then, one day, among millions of plants, a special one appeared. Because of a tiny accidental error in its makeup, scientists would later identify the guilty region as the SH4 gene. It didn't shed its grains. They clung to the stalk and waited. For wild nature, this was a failure. Such a plant couldn't sow itself, but for a human being, it was a gift from heaven. All you had to do was spot such ears, gather precisely those, and toss the seeds into the wet ground near your home. So began what scientists call domestication. The wild ancestor of rice bears the name Oryza rufipogon. From it, generation by generation, humans bred Oryza sativa, the very rice that sits on our plates. Without even realizing it, people were selecting plants with 2 key traits: grains that didn't fall off and larger grains. Together, these changes are called the domestication syndrome. The first subspecies to be tamed was the round-grained one, Japonica, and later, farther south, its long-grained cousin, Indica. This great transition is best seen a little further downriver, near the mouth of the Yangtze, in what is now Zhejiang province. There, about 7,000 years ago, lived the people of the Hemudu culture, and these were no longer wandering gatherers. Archaeologists found wooden houses raised on stilts above the damp earth, entire villages where people had settled down for good. They also uncovered huge stores of grain, enough to outlast more than one winter. And they found simple but brilliant tools, spades made from the shoulder blades of animals. With these bone spades, people turned over the wet soil for planting. And nearby, at a site called Tianluoshan, something more precious to a historian than any gold has been preserved: the traces of ancient paddy fields. This means people were no longer simply scattering seed wherever it might fall. They were taming the water, dividing the land into plots, holding moisture on it, tending the rice from sprout to ear. Right here, in this liquid mud, agriculture was being born. The change was quiet, but it turned everything upside down. As long as humans chased wild food, they couldn't settle down, and they couldn't feed many children. The rice paddy gave what had never existed before: a surplus, food that could be set aside for later. And wherever a reserve appears, so does power over it. Whoever owns the grain owns the people. The builders of the first states grasped this simple truth very early. Around the 50s BCE, during the Han Dynasty, a wise official named Gang Shouchang proposed something clever to the emperor: a system of granaries known as the ever-normal granaries. The idea was this: in bountiful years, when grain was plentiful and cheap, the state would buy up the surplus and store it in warehouses. And in years of famine, when prices soared and the poor had nothing to eat, the state would pull out the reserve and sell it cheaply. So, for the first time, power tried to rein in the eternal fear of hunger, not with prayer, but with a warehouse full of rice. But the real rice revolution came later, in the Song era. At the very start of the 11th century, around the years 1011 to 1012, Emperor Zhenzong made a decision that changed the fate of millions. He ordered a special rice brought into the country, a fast-ripening, drought-resistant variety from the kingdom of Champa, which lay in the lands of present-day Vietnam. This southern guest ripened so quickly that a single field could now yield not one harvest a year, but two. The consequences were staggering. The lands of Jiangnan, in the lower Yangtze, became a boundless granary. The cities of Suzhou and Huzhou filled up with rice to the brim, and people began to say that if these two were fed, then all the Middle Kingdom was fed. There was twice as much food, and twice as many people. China's population shot upward as it never had before. And here a central idea begins to emerge, one we'll keep returning to. The state held the water in its hands. The water gave birth to rice, and rice gave birth to and fed the people. Everything stood on the rice surplus: the taxes that filled the treasury, the armies that guarded the borders, the vast construction projects that outlived their creators. Beneath this whole colossus of human history lay one humble grain that once didn't want to fall on its own from a wild stalk by the river. Rice didn't stay in China. From its cradle by the great river, it set out on a journey that would stretch over thousands of years and span half the world. And, like any traveler, in each new land, it became a little different. First, the grain moved to the neighbors. Rice farming came to Korea in the distant Mumin era, roughly 1500 BCE. A little later it reached the Japanese islands, around the turn of the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE. There, in the period the Japanese call Yayoi, the wet paddy took root so firmly that it soon became the foundation of all life in those islands. But rice didn't only head east. Its long-grained brother indica pushed stubbornly to the west. Already in the 2nd millennium BCE, it had taken hold in South Asia, and from there it reached further, into the lands of Mesopotamia and Persia. The Western world first got a proper look at this plant thanks to war. When, around the 320s BCE, the army of Alexander the Great reached the eastern lands, the Greeks saw rice with their own eyes. A scholar named Theophrastus described the strange grass and wrote down its name as he'd heard it, oriza. From this word passed through many languages comes our rice. Then it was the Arabs' turn. Between the 8th and 10th centuries, during the great agricultural upsurge in the Islamic world, they brought rice to Egypt, to North Africa, and to the lands of present-day Spain, then known as Al-Andalus. That's how rice took root around Valencia, where it's still cooked today. But rice reached Europe proper surprisingly late. Only at the very end of the 15th century, around 1475, did rice arrive in the valley of the Po River in northern Italy, at the court of the wealthy Sforza family. Just think, by the time rice first rustled in Italian fields, China had already been growing it for several thousand years, and everywhere this grain went, it became more than food. It became sacred. On the island of Bali, people came up with something remarkable that still works to this day. Since roughly the 9th century, there has existed a system called subak. It's an entire network of water temples, where priests and farmers together decide who gets how much water for their fields and when. Water here is a shared treasure, and it's divided not by force, but by fairness and by faith. This wise system has proved so valuable that it has been added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. In Japan, rice has woven itself into the very soul of the people. In the local faith Shinto, it holds a place of honor, and the emperor himself performs an ancient rite every year, giving thanks for the new harvest. This festival is called Nina Meisai, so it turns out that the first person of the nation, once a year, personally bows to a grain of rice for feeding his people, and rice can reshape the very land itself. In Yunnan province in southern China lives the Han people. About 13 centuries ago, their ancestors began carving steps into the steep mountain slopes, terrace after terrace, so that water could flow from one level to the next and nothing would be wasted. Today, these terraces in the Honghe region resemble a giant staircase of mirrors reflecting the sky. They too have been recognized as a treasure of all humanity. But our story has another side, a darker one. Everything changed when European traders arrived in the eastern seas in the 16th century. To them, rice was no longer a sacred thing or even food. It was a commodity, something you could build a fortune on, and to build that fortune, people themselves began to be the price paid. The most bitter chapter of this story is written across the marshy lowlands of Georgia and South Carolina in North America. The white masters wanted to grow rice there, but didn't know how. It's a delicate and demanding craft. Those who did know how were the people brought in chains aboard ships from West Africa, from the very lands that bore the name Rice Coast. It was the knowledge of enslaved Africans that made the rich rice plantations possible. By their hands and their minds, the famous variety Carolina Gold was developed. The labor on the tidal fields was grueling beyond what's humanly bearable. People stood knee-deep in stagnant water under a scorching sun, surrounded by disease and mosquitoes, working that way from dawn until dark. In 1739, despair finally broke through. In the rice country along the Stono River, an uprising erupted. It was crushed brutally, but the memory remained. And out of the shared pain, language and customs of these people grew a distinct culture, Gullah Geechee, which still lives along those shores today. And this wasn't the only sorrow that commodity rice brought. On the island of Java, beginning in 1830, the Dutch colonizers introduced what they openly called the cultivation system. Peasants were forced to give up part of their land and part of their labor to grow the crops their masters wanted. Fields that could have fed the locals worked instead for a foreign treasury. In Burma, after the British conquest, the delta of the Irrawaddy River was turned into an enormous rice factory. When the Suez Canal opened and the route to Europe became short, such a flood of grain poured out of this land that it became the world's largest exporter of rice. Only the wealth flowed far away and didn't stay with those who bent their backs in the fields. And then the worst of it. In 1943, famine struck Bengal, claiming about 3 million lives. The horror of it lies in this. Grain from those very lands continued to be shipped out, and the relief for the starving failed. People died not because there was no rice at all, but because it had been taken from them. And just a couple of years later, in 1945, a similar tragedy overtook northern Vietnam. During military occupation, peasants were forced to plant crops the army needed instead of rice, and somewhere between 1 and 2 million people died of hunger. From this part of the story comes one hard conclusion. Once rice stopped being a gift of the earth and became simply a commodity for sale, the trade in it stopped being an honest exchange. Far too often it turned not into partnership, but into ruthless extraction. Grain flowed in rivers toward the powerful, while the weak were left with empty fields and hunger. The small white grain that had saved people from death for thousands of years became, in greedy foreign hands, a tool of their destruction. By the middle of the 20th century, humanity found itself in a race it could lose. There were more people on Earth, and more with each passing year, and there simply wasn't enough food. The The fields that had fed villages for centuries could no longer keep up with the swelling cities. Over entire countries hung the ancient specter of famine. And scientists understood. Either rice would feed this growing world, or the world would drown in want. In 1960, in a small place called Los Baños in the Philippines, the International Rice Research Institute opened its doors. Scientists from all over the world gathered there with one shared goal: to make the grain of rice work harder than it had in all the 10,000 years before. They didn't pray for a good harvest. They intended to create one, and they did. In 1976, a team led by the geneticist Gurdjieff Kush released into the world a variety with a dry-sounding name, IR36. Behind that dull label hid a small miracle. This rice ripened very quickly, which meant a single field could yield more harvests in a year, and it could fend off several pests and diseases at once, pests that had previously wiped out whole villages' crops. The peasants welcomed it as salvation. By the early 1980s, IR36 had become the most widely planted rice on the entire planet. It was sown across roughly 11 million hectares, endless fields stretching across many countries at once. And Gurdjieff Kush himself later received the World Food Prize, the highest honor for those who feed humanity. This was the Green Revolution. Harvests soared, hunger retreated. Millions of people who might have died stayed alive. It seemed like a clean victory, but every coin has two sides, and so did this one. The new varieties were hungry. To deliver such yields, they demanded a lot of water, a lot of fertilizer, a lot of pesticides. Poor peasants couldn't afford any of it, and they fell further and further behind their wealthier neighbors. The village split into those who rose up and those who were left with nothing. And there was more. When everyone around you plants the same miracle variety, the fields become defenseless. Let a new disease appear that this variety can't resist, and it can mow down the harvest across vast stretches all at once. The strength of uniformity turned into its weakness. And then scientists understood a simple thing. For rice to survive tomorrow, all the diversity built up over thousands of years had to be preserved. At the Institute, a vast vault was created, the International Rice Gene Bank. Today, it carefully holds more than 130,000 grain samples from all over the world. It's like a library of life, where every variety is a separate book with its own secret. If disaster strikes tomorrow, the answer may already be sitting here on a shelf, waiting for its hour. And one such answer from that vault has already saved countless lives. The rice lands have an ancient enemy: flooding. Rivers burst their banks, water covers the fields completely, and ordinary rice beneath it simply suffocates and dies within a few days. For a peasant, this means losing everything in one stroke. But in the rice collection, a rare gene was found, which scientists described around the year 2006. They named it Sub-1A. This gene essentially teaches the plant to hold its breath. Rice carrying it can stand entirely underwater for weeks without dying, and then, once the water recedes, calmly go on growing. Such scuba varieties were developed and distributed to peasants in India and Bangladesh under names like Swarna Sub-1. A plant able to live 2 weeks underwater turned a flood from a death sentence into just a bad day. But rice itself has a guilt of its own toward the planet, one that wasn't spoken of out loud for a long time. Flooded fields release methane gas into the air, and methane warms our planet powerfully. So it turns out that the grain feeding half the world is also heating the earth at the same time. And scientists set out to lessen that guilt. They found a simple technique. Don't keep the field underwater constantly. Let it dry out from time to time. This method is called alternate wetting and drying. There was another path too. Back in the 1980s, on the island of Madagascar, a priest named Henri de Laulanier came up with a special, gentle approach to caring for rice. It's known as the system of rice intensification. The plants are given more space, less water, and each seedling is tended individually, and the field produces more grain while using less. And in 2015, scientists pulled off something truly extraordinary. They transferred into rice a gene from barley called SUSIBA2, and the methane coming off such a field dropped many times over, while the grain yield actually went up. The plant has been taught to feed people and spare the planet at the same time, and even bolder ideas lie ahead. Out there in the fields, a massive international project called C4 Rice is underway. Its participants are trying to remake the very heart of the plant, the way it captures sunlight, modeled on corn, which does it far more efficiently. If they succeed, rice will yield roughly 1.5 times more grain than it does now. Other scientists are developing new varieties for Africa, where hunger still lurks close by, so that people there might finally have their own reliable staple. And when you take in this whole long journey at once, you grasp the essential thing. The story of rice is the story of humanity itself. It all began with a slender wild grass by the water's edge, whose grains scattered to the ground faster than a hungry hand could gather them. More than 10,000 years have passed, and that same rice is now being taught to hold its breath underwater and spare the planet's air. Between these 2 points, our entire destiny has unfolded. The first villages and the first states, sacred rites in the bloody fields worked by slaves, terrible famines, and the great deliverance from them. In every tiny white grain sitting on your plate today, thousands of years of human ambition and ingenuity are compressed, along with human suffering and a stubborn, unbending will to survive. We domesticated rice, but look closely, and it's rice that made us who we are.